Hello, comrades. Good evening. Tonight in the Communist Culture Club, we're looking at the subject of the Russian avant-garde, which is, of course, a huge subject. And you could say it started in the 1890s, going up to the 1890s, going up to the 1930s, encompassing paintings, writings, theater, sculptures, architecture, all sorts. They all had in common that they were inspired by the workers taking charge, doing away with the old, being revolutionary. It inspired various trends in paintings and in art, constructivism, futurism, cubism even, etc. Tonight, Roger Silverman is looking at mainly literature, but if anybody knows about the Russian avant-garde, would like to speak about paintings or other aspects of it, please do so when we're opening up for comments and questions from the floor. Over to you, Roger. Thank you for joining us.
Okay, thank you, Tina. Now, in Russia, literature and revolution are kind of inextricably intertwined. There's a proud, unbroken Russian tradition of defiance of successive autocratic regimes by artists and writers. It happened under the Tsars, it happened under the tyranny of Stalin and his successors, and it happens still today under the Putin dictatorship. There's no country with a richer tradition of literary and artistic protest against autocracy than Russia. It stretches back to the aftermath of the Decembrist revolt against Tsarism in 1825, when and ever since then, successive generations of writers have defied the censors and braved the living hell of Siberia to throw down their challenges to Tsars, commissars, and oligarchs. Even the Shakespeare of Russia, Alexander Pushkin, in the very early part of the 19th century, he only escaped the risk of execution through participation in the coup due to his exile at the time in southern Russia. Later in the 19th century, there was a writer called Chernyshevsky who was locked in the Peter Paul fortress. Dostoevsky endured a mock execution and years of hard labor in Siberia. And even the aristocratic Count Tolstoy, who was living in splendid seclusion as a hermit on his estate, even he was a kind of utopian socialist. And later, the list of writers and artists who perished in Stalin's gulag is almost endless. Even the years of the so-called thaw under Khrushchev, from the mid-50s to the mid-60s, was very short-lived, and it was brought to a sudden end by the trial of the writers Sinyavsky and Danil in 1966, following which there was a new crop of victims. In Russia, the attitude of the writer towards the state has almost always been one of defiance. The revolution liberated the creative energies of a whole generation who had grown up in a Russia thrown into turmoil by one shock after another. Defeat in the war against Japan, the 1905 revolution, the brutal repression that came in the aftermath. And by the way, there were thousands of executions by hanging at that time, known as Stolypin's necktie. The World War, of course, in which at least 2 to 3 million soldiers were killed. And then there came, of course, a decade of dizzying upheavals, the overthrow of Tsarism, the October Revolution, the Civil War, and then a new dark age of Stalinism. So the first years of the revolution gave a dynamic impetus to artistic experimentation. Artistic freedom flourished as never before or since. Theatre, cinema, poetry, music, art, and sculpture all sprang up and touched the lives of the population everywhere. For the first time, there was an explosion of popular creativity, with mass participation in street theatre, music, films, drama. There was even, in 1920, to mark the third anniversary of the storming of the Winter Palace, there was even a staged mass reenactment of the occasion. It was really actually a sort of highly hyped up enhancement of it. But in that extravaganza, 10,000 people participated. There was a renaissance of experimentation and creativity and imagination. Meyerhold in the theatre, Kandinsky in art, Prokofiev in music, Eisenstein in cinema, and of course there's countless more names that could be added. But tonight, the focus is going to be on literature. Now, in stark contrast to the stifling fumes of despotism soon to choke society, the Bolsheviks defended to the death the absolute right of artistic and literary freedom. As an integral part of his relentless struggle against the encroachments of censorship, Trotsky insisted, art, like science, not only does not seek orders, but by its very essence cannot tolerate them. Truly intellectual creation is incompatible with the lies, hypocrisy, and the spirit of conformity. Trotsky explicitly acknowledged the need at times for even the most flamboyant gestures in the interests of the further development of cultural life. He insisted, again a new quote, every new artistic or literary tendency has begun with a scandal, breaking the old respected crockery, bruising many established authorities. This flowed not at all solely from publicity seeking, although there was no lack of this. No, these people, artists as well as literary critics, had something to say. They had friends, they had enemies, they fought, and exactly through this they demonstrated their right to exist. Now, as we know, that didn't stop even Trotsky in his day engaging in some gentle mockery of the more exotic elements in the contemporary wave of artistic experimentation. Again, a quote, to be sure, a young futurist did not go to the factories and to the mills, but he made a lot of noise in cafes. He banged his fist upon music stands. He put on a yellow blouse. He painted his cheeks and threatened vaguely with his fist. I should point out Futurism was the dominant trend among the avant-garde in Russia at that time, and they welcomed the revolution. Conversely, in Italy, the Futurists actually rallied around the flag of Mussolini. Anyway, Lenin and Trotsky didn't always fully agree with the more extreme of these literary pioneers. Lenin expressed a kind of avuncular irritation with those who demanded the instant creation of a proletarian culture. For a start, he said, we'd be happy enough to get a decent bourgeois culture. A reasonable aspiration, after all, on the terrain of a peasant country still hobbling along on the technology of the medieval wooden plough amid a fog of feudal superstition and mass illiteracy. Trotsky, too, was critical of the impatience of some futurists for the instant overthrow of the old culture. And here, again, I want to quote a very important exposition of his ideas. He said, to say that futurism has freed art of its 1,000-year-old bonds of bourgeoisdom is to estimate thousands of years very, very cheaply. The call of the futurists to break with the past, to do away with Pushkin, to liquidate tradition, etc., has a meaning insofar as it is addressed to the old literary caste, to the closed-in circle of the intelligentsia. But the meaninglessness of this call becomes evident as soon as it's addressed to the proletariat. The working class does not have to and cannot break with literary tradition because the working class is not in the grip of such tradition. The working class doesn't know the old literature. It still has to commune with it. It still has to master Pushkin, to absorb him, and so overcome him. Nevertheless, it's noteworthy that even during the privations of the early 20s, for all their reservations, Lenin and Trotsky willingly endorsed the publication at state expense of the full range of artistic output, if only, as they put it jokingly in their words, for the sake of, quote, cranks and charlatans. The point being that even the most outlandish of tastes was still in those days provided for without question. The young intelligentsia experimented with new modes of expression in art, music, and poetry. The old forms and the old structures made no sense to them in an epoch of catastrophe. As the most talented of the new poets, Vladimir Mayakovsky, said of the turbulent period in which they had grown to adulthood, These events made futurists of us all. So at one end of the poetic spectrum, there were those like Khlyebnikov, who in 1912 wrote a manifesto called A Slap in the Face of Public Taste, and Khrushchev. They busied themselves literally with inventing a new language composed of meaningless syllables. This was called Zaum, which means chance sense, a poetry style utilizing nonsense words. One prime example of this is Khlyebnikov's poem Zaklyatia Smiechom, which means incantation by laughter, in which a series of permutations is generated, which was built by adding to the root word smiech, which means laughter, multiple nonsense prefixes, suffixes, and variations on the word. So you could translate bits of the poem as something like laughety, laughsome, laughness. I have to say it sounds funnier in Russian. But at the other end of the spectrum were those who strove to overcome their past record of rebellious individualism and fuse their hopes with the victory of the revolution. The most prominent of these was Mayakovsky himself. Now, he had started as a conspicuously ostentatious bohemian rebel poet, but unlike many of his contemporaries, he wholeheartedly welcomed the revolution. He called it my revolution. When the Civil War came, he voluntarily sacrificed his former quest for notoriety, and he subjected himself to an intense personal discipline and renounced his extraordinarily talented, larger-than-life ego to devote his talents exclusively to the service of the revolution. For 3 years, he worked flat out, day in, day out, composing catchy advertising jingles for the thousands of public information posters put out through the Civil War by the agitprop agency Rosta. Later, he put it very eloquently, I stamped on the throat of my own song. By the end of the Civil War, exhausted and still feeling personally frustrated and unfulfilled, he found himself increasingly at odds with the social filth and trash thrown up by the ebb tide of the fast-retreating world revolution, the speculators and kulaks and netmen, and the growing army of bureaucrats that were infesting the state apparatus and Soviet life. Yearning for fresh air, he went on a trip to the USA, and he wrote a futuristic poem celebrating the engineering feat of Brooklyn Bridge. But after the exhilaration of that experience, he returned to an exhausted and deflated society, and he could find no worthier focus for his talent than a series of bitingly sharp satirical plays scourging the new bureaucratic order. The best of these was a play called The Bedbug, in which the main character, a parasitic party hack who considered his role indispensable, was identified with that most vile species of poisonous insect, which was now infesting every aspect of Soviet life. The prevailing mood of despair was most dramatically captured by one demonstrative act on the part of the romantic peasant poet Sergei Yesenin. In 1925, Yesenin booked a room at a Moscow hotel, the Hotel Angleterre. There, he slashed his wrists and wrote a farewell suicide poem in his own blood, ending with the lines, "There's nothing new in dying, but living is no newer." Yesenin was a popular voice of the peasant youth, and his shocking act of conspicuous melodrama precipitated a wave of suicides. In spite of his own mood of discontent and disillusion, Mayakovsky considered it his obligation to do all that he could to break the evil spell, and he did this with a savage piece of mockery. He wrote a scathing parody of Yesenin's farewell poem, and it included the lines, "Was the hotel short of a bottle of ink? Did you really need to slash your veins? Your admirers rejoiced. A host of them have copied you, and they too are dead. But why increase the statistics by one death more? Why not increase the production of ink instead?" And he ended, "In this life, it's not difficult to die. To make life is far more difficult." And yet, 5 years later, this literary giant himself, Mayakovsky, went on to take his own life. And in his suicide note, he wrote, "My death is no one's fault. Please don't gossip. The dead hate gossip. My boat of love is smashed on the rocks of daily life." Anyway, neither individual rebellion, nor futuristic experimentation, nor devotion to the party cause, nor biting political satire had provided sufficient outlet for his energies in these perplexed times. For the last years of his life, Mayakovsky had been hounded to despair by the Stalinist puppy dog poet Demyan Biedny of the so-called Association of Proletarian Poets. Now, Biedny stood at the opposite pole to Mayakovsky of Soviet literature. He conformed to the stultifying drab sludge of so-called socialist realism. He was a scribbler of Stalinist doggerel, an archetypal hack who slavishly towed the party line during its worst excesses. As head of the Association of Proletarian Writers, anyone displaying any original or creative talent came under his attack, and a special target of his being Mayakovsky. He was rewarded by the regime with a shower of ill-deserved honors. But even after later himself falling out of favor, due not to any sign of rebellion against the establishment, but simply to his own debauched lifestyle, he later managed to crawl back into the regime's good graces by penning appalling verses, fawning Stalin's police state, and explicitly glorifying, in one case, the execution of Tukhachevsky and the Red Army top brass. His writing was so unutterably awful that even Stalin at one time remarked, 10 volumes of verse by Demyan Biedny are not worth one poem of Mayakovsky's. While driving to suicide and later executing outright a whole generation of talented writers, Stalin also commandeered the popularity of others and in effect kidnapped them in service of his regime. The best example is the almost equally terrible plight of Maxim Gorky. Now, Gorky was born into a grindingly poor peasant family. He worked in a succession of sweatshops. He became an eloquent storyteller and a genuine voice of the people. He wrote a classic 3-volume autobiography of his life, which was faithfully turned into a stunningly beautiful series of 3 films, which I strongly recommend, if you can get hold of them, do watch them, directed by Mark Donskoy, one rare case of a creative artist who did manage to survive the Stalin era intact. Now, what happened to Gorky? Gorky rejoiced at the downfall of Tsarism, but he distrusted the Bolsheviks and he shrank from the harsh imperatives of the revolution. At first, he escaped the dilemma by taking refuge in Capri, and he continued to live there through the first years even of Mussolini's fascist dictatorship. Then later, he was lured back to Russia by Stalin to become a kind of token literary mascot. He was pampered in luxury, showered with multiple awards and prizes, and he had whole cities and parks named in his honor. But he was forced to play the part of a laureate of the regime. So towards the end, he did make feeble attempts to intercede for Stalin's victims and to deplore Stalin's regime's excesses. But he ended his days himself as a virtual prisoner, and soon he was quietly put to death and buried, of course, with due pomp and ceremony. Most of this brilliant generation of writers found other ways to cope with the overwhelming pressures of the time. As the world revolution receded and Soviet society became suffocated by the dead hand of Stalinism, the tightening stranglehold on art and literature became an indispensable element in the consolidation of bureaucratic tyranny. Those writers that managed even temporarily to survive felt it necessary to resort increasingly to grotesquerie, surrealism, and satire, the better to hurl their barbs at the new regime more obliquely. For instance, Yevgeny Zamyatin wrote the classic futuristic dystopian novel We, that novel was the original prototype for its later and far inferior Western imitations, Brave New World by Aldous Huxley, and of course George Orwell's 1984. Another writer, Isaac Babel, was a celebrated writer of short stories, the best known of them describing the Civil War and the life of Russian Jews in Odessa. Naturally, he came under the shadow of the purges. In 1934, at the first Congress of the Union of Soviet Writers, Babel came to the stand and announced that he was becoming, quote, the master of a new literary genre, the genre of silence. He was soon arrested, and under horrific torture, he was forced to incriminate several of his contemporaries. But later, he had the courage to make the following confession to his interrogators. He said, I asked the inquiry to take into account that though in prison, yes, I committed a crime. I slandered several people. Babel was summarily tried and shot. One of the most outstanding writers of his generation was the novelist and playwright Mikhail Bulgakov. His most famous work was the novel The Master and Margarita, which was never published in his lifetime. This was a shocking and savage satire set partly in Moscow during the 1930s, where Satan appears among a crowd of bureaucratic functionaries and sycophants. And another setting is in Jerusalem 2,000 years ago, where we meet Pontius Pilate and a certain Jesus of Nazareth, among a host of others. Now, Bulgakov was a critic of the regime, but he was no revolutionary. And no doubt for that reason, he was to some extent protected from the terrible fate of many of his contemporaries. He was never arrested, let alone tried and executed, but he was subjected to a fate which was also unbearable for him. He was denied permission to publish his later novels or to stage his plays. He pleaded in vain to be allowed to emigrate to escape the stifling of his talent and the suffocating routine of his life. And of course, this was denied. Then he died in 1940, perhaps just in time to escape execution. Some writers escaped the same kind of fate by muffling their protest, using gentle mockery and keeping safely to mere journalistic sketches with just hints of very gentle satire. Among these were the duo Ilf and Petrov, who were also, like Babel, products of the rich, earthy folk culture of Odessa. Another was Mikhail Zoshenko, who used a very simple deadpan style of satire in vignettes which were published in short newspaper columns. And these gained him widespread popularity without ever reaching a scale of daring that might actually bring him to the attention of the censors. Some writers gained a further temporary lease of life by seeking relative safety using a clever subterfuge, by confining themselves to writing for children. Many of these showed remarkable ingenuity in their subversive use of this genre. I particularly like one example, the case of Yevgeny Schwartz. For just one performance, he succeeded in smuggling past the censors a play for children. It was called The Dragon, and it was about a village terrorized by a dragon which offers it protection but demands in return the annual sacrifice of one local maiden of its choice. Then a hero arrives called Lancelot, who slays the dragon, and the village is liberated. However, Lancelot then disappears, and the glory for his action is stolen and usurped by the corrupt town mayor, who fraudulently awards himself the title of Dragon Killer. And soon he becomes an even more hated tyrant. So the village is languishing under the tyranny of the fake dragon killer. But soon, however, the village becomes festooned with the mysterious appearance on the town walls of the letter L, and they feel hope that their hero Lancelot will return to liberate them anew. Now, it doesn't take much explanation. It's a reference that was certainly not lost on the delighted Moscow audiences, who were also waiting for the return of a certain L from the usurper, and who enthusiastically applauded its one and only performance on stage, for there was to be no repeat performance. Another group of writers who sometimes resorted to children's literature for clandestine anti-Stalinist propaganda was the Oberiu group. Now, these were early Soviet avant-garde writers whose absurdist innovations made them controversial in their time and landed many of them in prison. And they used an often violent brand of humor. I want to talk about the most conspicuous members of this group, who were Alexandra Pieviedensky and Daniil Harms. Now, Harms was the most shocking and hilarious of the group. He wrote a dystopian novel reminiscent of Kafka's Trial. His stories are violent and his characters are completely cold and amoral. The Russia he presents has been described as cruelty's utopia. His writings and his whole persona frightened the regime, and Harms ended up dying of starvation in a lunatic asylum. Now, all the members of that group show a bitterly dark picture. Here's a quote from one poem by Nikolai Zabolotsky. The horses of adjectives trample the faltering figures of nouns. The war elephants of the subconscious crawl out and shuffle like giant dwarfs. Another one from Nikolai Oleynikov. There it is, beyond reproach, the marvellous structure of the cockroach. Oh, energetic cockroachy legs. They're saying something, they're scribbling on air. So, like their counterparts in the West, but on the even grander dimensions of the Russian steppes, writers like Harms and Verdiensky used paradox and absurdity to mirror the horrors and irrationality of the epoch. It was a kind of anticipation of surrealism. Because what, after all, could be more grotesque, more absurd, let alone more horrifying than the nightmare that was hanging over their heads? The mass purges, the show trials, the labor camps, the millions incarcerated in the Stalinist gulag. And then, hardly a hair's breadth ahead of them, the World War, the Holocaust, the Nazi gas chambers, the atom bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. So, like many Western writers during the madness of the 20th century in Europe, people like Kafka, Ionesco, Beckett, and many more, these writers too created an entirely new genre that incorporated the madness of the world around them into their art. I just want to finish with a postscript to look at a very different and a much more recent act of artistic rebellion. There's a direct link. Do comrades remember the Pussy Riot Trio in 2012? They were a feminist punk rock performance art group which staged a provocative, unauthorized gig at a Moscow cathedral. And they were jailed for that. Now, they considered themselves an audacious modern configuration of the Oberiu group. They said so in so many words. The Pussy Riot demonstrators explicitly traced a direct link to that school of dissident Soviet writers who had made the very last heroic stand of Russian modernism in the 1930s before the flame of artistic creativity was finally snuffed out by the Stalinist terror. And they referred explicitly to the members of the Oberiu group. One of them, Tolonikova, quoted Verdiensky's aphorism, "The inexplicable is our friend." And she commented that, again, here's the quote, "The Oberiu poets and their search for thought on the edge of meaning were finally embodied when they paid with their lives, which were taken by the senseless and inexplicable Great Terror. Paying with their lives, these poets unintentionally proved that they were right to consider irrationality and senselessness the nerves of their era. Thus, the artistic became an historical fact." The performance of these punk rockers owes something to the same heroic Russian tradition of rebellion. And when they staged their demonstration in 2012, there was a huge groundswell of public sympathy in their defense, a public mood that even won reluctant acknowledgement from the authorities in the form of the relatively mild sentence demanded by the prosecutors and the rather grudging hints by Putin himself that they should not be treated too harshly. Of course, that's judged presumably only by the none too gentle standards of his KGB heritage. This gives the Pussy Rioters a proud place in the deeper Russian tradition of artistic protest. What these performers did was the right and the prerogative of artists throughout history to find their own voice, no matter how shocking the initial effect. And they would have found no more enthusiastic champion than Trotsky at their side today. And I want to quote again from Nadezhda Tolokonnikova. She in particular places the Pussy Riot Act firmly in the tradition of 2 centuries of Russian protest. Listen to what she said. This is a trial of the entire political system of the Russian Federation, repeating all of the worst moments of Russian history. What was behind our performance? Nothing other than the autocratic political system. Pussy Riot's performances can either be called dissident art or political action that engages art form. Either way, our performances are a kind of civic activity amidst the repressions of a corporate political system that directs its power against basic human rights and civil and political liberties. We put on political punk performances in response to a government that is rife with rigidity, reticence, and caste-like hierarchical structures. It is so clearly invested in serving only narrow corporate interests. In their closing speeches to the court, the Pussy Riot women turned the tables and placed the Russian state itself on trial. Another of them, Maria Alyokina, called the performance that prompted their arrest a small and somewhat absurd act that has snowballed into an enormous catastrophe. And she correctly concluded, this would obviously not happen in a healthy society. Russia, she said, as a state, has long resembled an organism sick to the core, and the sickness explodes out into the open when you rub up against its inflamed abscesses. Having spent almost half a year in jail, I've come to understand that prison is just Russia in miniature. Now, these courageous women inspired millions by their example, and just like generations of Russian artists and writers before them, their act was not a diversion or an escape from reality, but a weapon with which to change it. And that, I think, is the heritage of Russian literature. Thanks, comrades.
Thank you very much, comrade. Very interesting opening. Comrades, if anybody wants to ask questions or make contributions, please click raise hand. To get the ball rolling, a couple of questions to you. Now, starting with your last bit, and that is the sort of the question of the artist and politics, which can sometimes the artist becomes incorporated perhaps by political trends. You know, I mean, you've mentioned in your opening all the way through. I mean, they either got incorporated by Stalinism, or they were executed, or they fled the country. So it is very difficult to keep art and politics apart. So somebody like the Pussy Riots, I mean, they were after they were doing their concerts, etc. I mean, they were paraded around the West and sort of as an anti-Putin method as well, weren't they? As a weapon against Putin. But I don't think they liked that, did they? They tried not to get incorporated on that front either, which was not always successful. But they seem to be rebelling a little bit against that. Can you say a bit more about that? Do you know anything more about that?
They certainly,
as a pro-imperialist, sort of against Russian pro-Western imperialism.
Well, that's the thing. They were absolutely rejected any kind of praise from the West or any idea that they were upholders of your Western culture or anything like that, because that was playing into the hands of the slanders of the regime itself. And I think they're very, very much in the tradition. I mean, as you can see from what I said, I mean, right back to the beginnings of Russian literature, which really only dates from, well, the late 17th, late 18th, early 19th century. But you can't think of one prominent writer or even a secondary writer who wasn't in protest and in rebellion against the regime, and how much more so under Stalin, apart from the one or two hacks that I also mentioned, the Dimion Biednys and so on. I mean, most of them, even then, I mean, Gorky just literally held ransom as a prisoner by the Stalin regime and then quietly murdered. I mean, yeah, and they very much the Pussy Riot trio are very much in their tradition.
So, I mean, this is, of course, it is a situation which is quite terrible. I mean, if, imagine that you're in Russia, you're part of, the revolutionary upsurge, or you even go to Russia to support it, support the revolution, support the working class taking power, etc. Everything, you're successful, etc. And then you see it turning into its opposite. And what you do, I mean, it was difficult for Bolsheviks, for money Bolsheviks. Do you support this or do you speak up? You can't speak up. What do you do when you see things unraveling and turning into its opposite? Can you speak a little bit more about that? How did different artists deal with this kind of, with what must be a really soul-destroying, heartbreaking realization? You understand you fought all your life for, revolution, human liberation, you gave your life to it, and then it turns into its opposite. How did the different artists deal with that tragedy?
Well, many of them committed suicide. Those who could emigrated. Many, as I say, committed suicide. The rest tried to accommodate the regime, as I say. Some of them, like Ilfin Petrov and Zoshenko, they managed to just manage to survive with very, very, very gentle satire, which never, of course, attacked the big bureaucrats. It never attacked the state, but it poked fun at little petty provincial bureaucrats and so on, and managed to just kind of walk that line. But as I say, most of the people that I listed there were people who they simply could not reconcile themselves to the regime, and they either kept their mouths shut or they just wrote and thought, to hell with it. Let's see what comes. I mean, it's wrenchingly tragic to look at the, I mean, it's hard to imagine a generation of such incredible, explosive talent and creativity, which of course was part of the whole, it was thrown up by the revolution itself and so on. But to see a generation like that so completely crushed and pulverized and trodden underfoot by the brutal, vulgar regime of Stalin.
Absolutely. Got a couple of people with their hands up now. Ian was first. If you could start your video, and Matthew. Hi, Ian.
Good evening, comrades, and thank you, Roger. Excellent. I really enjoyed listening to that. And it just, well, it took me back to when I was a student in Moscow. There was a fabulous art gallery in Park Kultury, the Park of Culture. And it was fascinating because you could go into the 1920s rooms and there was all this vigorous, wonderful, vibrant art. And then you go into the 1930s rooms and there was just room after room of just utter rubbish, just dreadful, pictures of Lenin trying to hail a taxi and, all that kind of dreadful rubbish. Strange, pictures of Lenin were changed depending on which part of the Soviet Union they were used in. He was made to look a little bit more Eastern in Eastern parts of the Soviet Union, that kind of thing. And he's always got this big jaw, and it looks. And then, of course, when you go and see him in the mausoleum, he's a little ginger bloke. And it was fascinating because you compare the even the period just before the revolution was so much more vibrant, and some artists as well were themselves quite conservative, but their art was revolutionary. So Igor Stravinsky, for example, wasn't particularly left wing or whatever, but The Rite of Spring was absolutely breathtaking when it first came out, and so it's an interesting one because on the one hand, a lot of people on the left tend to think that art has to somehow be tendentious. It has to have, an obvious kind of political meaning. And I think that's something that is part of the regrettable legacy of Stalinism, really, where you get everything has to have a sort of meaning and be very preachy and all the rest of it. In fact, quite often it turns people off. Whereas what was really incredible was the satire. And the other thing about it, of course, was that artists having to work under conditions of brutal repression become incredibly creative. And, as you've pointed out in your talk, so Bulgakov and various others just became incredibly inventive in order to get through the censorship and just make it. And then just finally, there was one little thing that struck me. I did my research into the political abuse of psychiatry in the former Soviet Union, and there was a short story by Anton Chekhov called Ward Number 6, Palatar Number 6, and people used to speak in allegories and references to art and literature in a way in which people in the West often don't, because in the West people were so kind of inundated with just rubbish popular culture that very few people actually read the stuff. Anyway, there I was doing my research on the political abuse of psychiatry, and in Komsomolskaya Pravda there was a little article, and it just said Palatar Number 6 выпускает не всех. So ward number 6, not everybody gets discharged. And it was a straightforward reference to the abuse of political psychiatry, the abuse of psychiatry in the USSR. And it was done precisely with a reference to a short story by Chekhov. And the short story by Chekhov, by the way, has got nothing to do with the political abuse of psychiatry. It's about a psychiatrist who ends up being incarcerated in his own ward. But of course, the parallel was there, and the parallel was obvious to everybody because people read Chekhov, people read Dostoevsky, people in a way in which, most British people don't even read Dickens. So it was quite a strange place to be in a way, because although I felt that there was very little that was progressive about the Soviet Union at all, what was quite extraordinary was that because of the absence of rubbish television and popular culture, people had little choice but to read voraciously. And when they wanted to talk about political stuff, they did it in an allegorical way. They used a kind of Aesopian fable about, often with reference to bits of art and literature. That was all I wanted to add. Thank you.
Thanks, Ian. Do you want to say anything on that, Roger?
No, really. I agree with everything that Ian said, but if anybody else
has one other tiny little thing, I did have a little note here. What was also fascinating was that a lot of people, once they left the repressive nature of the Soviet Union, I'm thinking here of Andrei Tarkovsky, his films were never as good as when he was operating under conditions of brutal repression. So, Zerkalo, Mirror, was a brilliant film. And then his last film, Nostalgia, when he was sort of comfortably ensconced in Italy or whatever, it was just, yeah, whatever. Yeah.
I also find, I mean, with paintings, there are some artists, when you talk about meaning and stuff, you know, I mean, Kandinsky is perhaps the most famous one you think about when you think about Russian art. And he wasn't very political, you know, I don't think he would describe himself as a socialist, though he did work for the Ministry of Culture after the Russian Revolution. But he was you know, he was thriving under this revolutionary period, doing away with the old, you know, and freeing the form, etc. So it wasn't out and out political, his art, but it got, you know, it was revolutionary in that sense, because he just broke all the previous forms and rules of paintings and just did something entirely different. And he's a fantastic artist. And he didn't stay in the Soviet Union either. He left because he wasn't very political, but it did free a lot of artists who came to Russia and were inspired by that. Matthew.
Yeah, thanks, Roger. It was really, really good, really useful. I think the thing is that obviously what you have, as you say, is this enormous explosion of creativity, which is, I mean, obviously starts under the old regime. You know, the fact that you have this essentially an entire, you know, people in revolt, you know, against the regime, and this, of course, then, and at the time, you know, it generally before the First World War, where you do have an enormous degree of you know, creativity and new art, but particularly, I think, in Russia, and it's that intersection with the revolution, and it's not always. I mean, the thing is, it sort of intersects. It doesn't actually feed directly in at all. I mean, if you take, you know, the likes of, I mean, Gorky, of course, was a member of the Social Democratic Party, and did actually orientate at one point to the far left. I mean, Lunacharsky and Bogdanov and these people, and he held a famous Capri school, you know, in this, you know, remote island in Italy, which is now, of course, full of rich people. But you know, which Trotsky attended and so on, you know. But Gorky, of course, was a deep critic of the Bolshevik regime from the start. Similarly, Mayakovsky. I mean, Mayakovsky, you know, was a member, I think, of the Bolsheviks for about 6 months. I mean, obviously, you know, very deeply political guy. I mean, there was a thing where he was arrested, I think, in 1912 or 1913 by the Okhrana, and he of course was thrown in jail. And his message to his sister was, "Bring me my artist's materials and a copy of Capital. I need to do some studying." But he was like this dominant force. I mean, you know. I mean, he tried to organise all these artists and all these things, you know, throughout the 20s, all his effort to try and organise this, you know, in groups and put out publications and all this sort of stuff. And that's all Mayakovsky. And of course, he's also, of course, this really incredible painter stroke cartoonist of the revolution. I mean, all that propaganda, as you say, all that propaganda stuff is all him. You know, it's like this dominant image of the revolution is Mayakovsky, you know. And the extraordinary thing, of course, now, of course, all this revolutionary art, of course, is worth millions and millions, which is quite ridiculous, as the alienation of art, you know, something that's been created for revolution and now is now prized by the capitalists and hidden away from the mass of humanity, which itself is a crime. And it really, I think you can almost look at Mayakovsky as like the arc, you know, because obviously the arc of the revolution, because obviously he has this hugely, he's hugely influential in the revolution. And it's the point at which he shoots himself in 1930, in which, you know, really it marks almost the end of that period. And as you say, the question of the suppression of that art and the move to the absurd socialist realism, which is actually quite, you know, similar to fascist art in many ways. And of course, you get also, as Serge details, you know, have these artists who are forced to shout the lie and whisper the truth. There's also, as you say, I mean, brilliant guys like Yesenin. I mean, Yesenin's well worth reading. He's a brilliant poet, absolutely fabulous. And even the ones who are reactionary. There was a guy that Serge met who was a reactionary. He was caught up in some, you know, Tupney Halfpenny provocation, and the local checker said, actually wrote to Lenin and said, look, do we have the right to shoot one of Russia's only 2 or 3 poets of the first order, and Lenin was forced to write back, so how can we shoot the others and spare the poets? So they shot the poor bugger. You know, it's an extraordinary period. It really is an extraordinary period, and it is well worth looking at the stuff and reading and going into the history. Thanks.
Thanks, Matthew. Roger, if you want to ever come in and reply to anybody, just
Not so far, no.
Ben, please. Hi.
Thank you. I'm really glad that that's working. Thank you, Roger, for an amazing presentation. Really enlightening. I'm grateful that Olga in the chat has mentioned Andrei Platonov, who I think is much neglected Soviet writer who I'm very grateful for. Olenka Zupančič and others of the Slovene school of psychoanalytic Marxism for revitalizing interest in. I suppose I was kind of curious if Roger has seen, because I know that Tarkovsky has come up in discussion, sees any influences either in a contemporary field or in other areas of Soviet genre fiction that is inspired by these different kinds of avant-gardisms. My go-to example is the Strugatsky brothers, who were the inspiration behind Tarkovsky's Stalker with their novel Roadside Picnic, and also the really amazing work Hard to Be a God, which is a quite interesting meditation on the rise of Stalinism from revolutionary conditions. Like a very brief summary of the novel is that a group of scientists visit alien culture with a model for how their civilization will develop across the years. But unfortunately, they start to notice a strange deviation and a rise of, well, effectively a dictatorial power, which might also be an allegory for the rise of fascism across Europe, where it was supposed to be unthinkable in the wake of Enlightenment reason as well, and how this presents a radical deviation. The second thing, I suppose, the second question for Roger is, might well be, what do you make of contemporary, obviously you were talking about Pussy Riot earlier, who is a truly amazing example of political art, but do you see any kind of, in the contemporary art scene, do you see any art that challenges, sort of a very common refrain about how art is almost entirely co-opted by the capitalist system? And if so, what are your thoughts? Thank you.
Good questions, Roger.
I'm afraid they're very good questions, and I have to confess I haven't got much to say to answer them, because Ben, I'd be very interested if you can give me more information. And maybe I haven't heard of some of the works that you mentioned, and if you could pass them on to me, I'll be very interested to follow them up. Of course, I know of Platonov, but I've never actually read any Platonov, and I'm not particularly well up on I haven't really got much to say on that. But then the more recent stuff that you're talking about, I haven't obviously kept up, and I'd be very interested if you could give me more. Just pass on the references.
Perhaps Ben, you could also put some in the chat, and I can pop them out. That'd be great. Thanks, Ben.
Let me take your email. Yes, sure.
Yeah, revolutionary contemporary art is a tricky one, isn't it? It's extremely difficult to get into mainstream or to get yourself heard. But I'm sure everybody's got their own favorites. John is next, please.
Oh.
Hi, you're unmuted already.
Am I okay? Sorry, thank you. Yeah, this is all very, very fascinating. Thank you very much. I have a question, and I've been trying to sort of formulate it, but keep listening to people here. I suppose it's really we're thinking about Russian avant-garde, and you started off with sort of references to futurism, and futurism in different countries kind of took on a different shape, and politically. So yes, the obvious one is that it lurches hugely towards the right, but there are some other countries where it's lurching towards the left as well. And I'm wondering if there's kind of links that we can pull together. So I'm thinking about the concept of avant-garde and what kind of common links there might be there. So when we think of avant-garde, we're thinking about the art as a vehicle for something which is socially and politically motivating, and there is activity. There is the idea of being at the forefront of something that's happening. But then also we need to, because it's an artistic movement, then there's the creative aspect. So there's the stylistic elements, and I also am aware that the you made it very clear that you're talking about literature, and maybe other people could open that up in terms of thinking about art and so on. But what are these stylistic elements? So kind of somewhat divorced from social or political concerns. So we've got these kind of two strands of the avant-garde that are together. There's the kind of political dynamic, the vanguardism, if you like, but there's also the way in which the arts themselves are transgressing, moving beyond what accepted norms are. And if you think about Mayakovsky as an example, even him as an individual, I mean, he was well traveled, so he's attending Proust's funeral. He's meeting Cocteau, he's meeting Picasso, and so on. So you have artists, intellectuals, radical thinkers coming together and thinking. So I'm wondering, when you're looking at Russian avant-garde, and perhaps yes, specifically through literature, are you thinking that there are some commonalities that we can draw upon, so that there are these strands, whether it's conceptual, artistic strands, or whether they are also political ideas that can be drawn together? And if so, what shape do they take? How do they manifest themselves? And is there a trajectory which leads forwards to us in the present day? So are these figures like Mayakovsky, like some of the great names that have been mentioned this evening, are these figures something that we can trace back to? Is there a lineage here of avant-gardism, political level and the artistic level?
Interesting question, Roger. Got anything?
I'm very, I don't know. I mean, I think all the comrades who've spoken probably seem to know at least as much, or if not more, than me about these things. But I mean, I on that last question though, I mean, I think particularly in Russia, how do I put it? There's no way they could not but be political, because of the stifling nature of the regime, the feudal culture, the brutal repression, and so on. There was no way that I mean any of the writers that I mentioned are going right back to the beginning. I mean, as I said, Pushkin, who's regarded as the founder, really, of modern Russian literature, who was he actually welcomed the fact that he'd been sent into exile in southern Russia, and was therefore not available to participate in the Decembrist coup in St. Petersburg in 1812. Not 1812, 1825. That's right. He was even the poetry and so on, which seems to be non-political, it always has that tinge behind it. There was his, for instance, his long poem Boris Godunov, which is about a historical event, but it was very much a kind of veiled attack on autocracy, on Tsarist autocracy. Even if you take Gogol, who's one of my favorite authors, who wrote a complete nonsense. He wrote incredible fantasies. Really, there's almost nothing can compare with them. He wrote the one fantasy that he wrote was a short story called The Nose. And it was about somebody who woke up one morning and found that his nose had disappeared. And then he got very angry about this, and he sort of went to the police, and he sent letters to the local newspaper and said, has anybody seen my nose, and what's happened, and where is it? And then he goes out walking, and then he sees his nose walking down the street. He's wearing a big official overcoat of somebody in the hierarchy, in the higher ranks of the hierarchy of the Tsarist nobility. And all he can see, I suppose, he's got a collar up there and a hat pulled down, a Russian hat, and all he can see is this nose sticking out. And he follows it down the street and says, what's he doing? What's he doing? That's my nose. Where's he going? And he actually goes up to him, and he follows him into a church. And the guy kneels down in the church, and he's praying there with his nose sticking out, of course. He's praying in the church, and he taps him on the shoulder and says, what's going on? You are after all my nose. And the nose turns round to him and he says, excuse me, I can see from your style of dress, there's no way there could be any social relations between us. I'm a far higher rank than you are, and please don't bother me. He wrote another novel called Dead Souls, which was about a crook who goes round visiting different landlords. They have to pay tax on the number of serfs that they own, but the ones that have died, the authorities haven't caught up with it yet, so he's still paying tax on them. So he has to have a scheme whereby he goes to all of them and he offers to buy the dead souls, the dead serfs. They were known as the kind of jargon was to call them souls because they were people. So he wanted to buy up the. I mean, I'm giving all these examples because everything was political. And one other I want to mention, Saltykov-Shchedrin, who's an incredibly, just a very, very funny writer in the sort of second half of the 19th century, who wrote fables. There were little stories about animals mostly, just like Aesop's fables, but every one of them had a sharp, satirical, political slant to them. For instance, one about one fish who pleads with the shark not to eat him. Because he says, look, I mean, we can all live together. And what's what is the purpose of, I'm sure we can settle this. And it was a deliberate and most conscious satire on the liberals, on how futile it was to try and reason with the oppressor. And I mean, I'm giving all these examples because they're all absolutely clearly political and clearly aimed against the establishment and against the autocracy. And I think that stretched, of course, into the 20th century even more so. Well, I've given a number of examples, and one way or another, even the mildest of them, apart from the ones who completely capitulated and just became hacks, like Duman Biedny, and of course a whole host of other people. But all the rest, at least they gave kind of at least mild hints of criticism of the regime, and in some cases outright defiance.
Thank you, Roger. Richard is next. Richard Chilvers. Hello. Can you unmute yourself, please?
Thank you, Roger, for your talk. But to be honest, I had a bit of criticism here, really, because I mean, like anything, there's a dialectic in Russian history. I mean, to be honest, Russian literature previous to the revolution was a revolutionary literature anyway, whether it be Tolstoy, Dostoevsky, Turgenev. I mean, it's the heart of European culture in terms of writing. And the revolution, in some ways, I mean, I personally think that the development of film and art and architecture was one of the great benefits from the Russian Revolution, rather than some of its writing. And you left out whole, because it's a dialectic, you left out the whole period. You went right on to Putty Riot, but some great literature came out of the denunciation of Stalin in 1956 during the Khrushchev era, and after Brezhnev within the Gorbachev era. You only have to talk about great poets like Voznesensky, Yevtushenko, and even Solzhenitsyn, although I'm afraid Solzhenitsyn, although he's in prison and everything, and actually is one of the you could probably link him back to Dostoevsky, and that's probably why and a bit as a nationalist really, and that's supposedly very influential on Putin himself. But I think that I just think that in fact that the revolutionary literature of Russian, which actually came back into the 50s, 60s, 70s, the great novels of Gerasimov, what's his name, after the Second World War, and during the Second World War. So I just wonder whether I just thought you missed out a whole period of Russian literature, Russian culture, which has to do with that. There's a whole, like in any people, there's regression and progression, and I think that's all my saying, Roger. Anyway, thanks very much.
Thanks, Richard. I mean, we did ask Roger to speak about the Russian avant-garde, which I think
I know, yeah.
kind of did. But if you have anything to say, Roger, on that?
Well, I was going to say that too, yeah, but you're quite right. I mean, there was a certain sort of during the period of the thaw, there was a beginning of a flowering. People like Yevtushenko and there's a better poet, but I can't remember his name for the time being. You know who I mean? But it was, well, as I say, it doesn't really come within the genre of avant-garde, and it was, I'd say, it was mild compared to the kind of things I was talking about from the first half of the 20th century. So, but yeah, you're quite right, Richard. That's a gap that needs filling.
In that vein, also, we've got a question in the chat, which I'll quickly read out. Roger, do you have anything to say on Mikhail Bakhtin, who Tam, the person in the chat, has only recently learned of from the Radical Anthropology group? He seems to have been able to work within the late Soviet system with integrity and much worth to say. Perhaps good proof that it was political revolution that was needed, not the disaster of counter-revolution. Do you know anything about Mikhail Bakhtin?
I've got to say, no. I'm really sorry. I'm learning a lot today.
Absolutely, and it's quite understandable. You were tasked with doing
I will make a note of that, and I'll look him up too. Thanks, comrade.
Yeah.
The
next person we've got is Paul, whose camera doesn't work, so he's only going to be speaking.
Hi. Yes, thanks for that, Roger. There's lots of interesting stuff that came out, and in the discussion as well. One of the key themes that came out for me was like how whenever the working class is at its peak, at its strength, there's alongside that there are sort of cultural and social steps forward that are made, and you've got the revolution, you've got the Russian avant-garde, and then with Stalin, obviously, you've got socialist realism. But I think somebody else alluded to it, that the kind of the full effects of the revolution on culture and art did span. There did seem to be some really interesting film and literature and so on in Russia. As I think it was Ian said, people like Tarkovsky, they were like they struggled to get the exposure that they deserved. I mean, in the 1970s as well, you've got Mark Fisher talks about how the strength of the working class feeds into the cultural explosion around psychedelia, music, women's movement, gay liberation, and so on. And now in a period of defeat, and you look at the left, and the left is very culturally conservative in my experience, you know, like not open to innovation or even within itself, let alone being an inspiration or creating culture that's revolutionary in that sense. And my question is, if you could maybe elaborate more on how the Bolsheviks dealt with that tension, you know, of like sort of creatives and the needs of the party and the revolution and so on.
No, that's a good question. There was a Ministry of Culture straight away, wasn't it? And that was led by Kandinsky. Did it incorporate other artists? How did it try to move forward art? I mean, there was all these roster posters as well. They were quite inspiring and quite good, weren't they?
Mm. Yeah, for sure. Yeah.
Anything?
I think actually the Russian, you know, the explosion wasn't, you know, just occurring in Russia either. It was across the world. You know, like I know in Germany you've got like the Bauhaus and the Cologne Progressives, which I really recommend people to look at some of the kind of agitprop type stuff they did. Anyway, sorry, that's it.
Thanks, Paul. Roger, how did the Bolsheviks engage then with art officially? Do you know much about that?
Yeah, I mean, as I said, they were very indulgent towards it, while at the same time quite clear in their own sometimes criticisms. But I mean, their position was, I mean, it is extraordinary that right through the Civil War, that they still allocated resources to the publication of literature, even literature that they disapproved of. So I mean, they really did have the most, what should we say? I don't like to use the word liberal, but you know, completely not only permissive, but actually encouraged the development. Those quotes from Trotsky that I mentioned were very clear that he said they have to be, even if they are a bit flamboyant and a bit provocative, but they have to be because that's what art has to do. And so really, that's all I have to say about that. I was going to say, I see that in the chat, John offered to say something about Bakhtin, and I'd be interested to learn something about him. So perhaps he'd like to come in.
Yeah, John, do you want to come back in? John Climo, if you could click raise hand, I can make you a panelist again. Chris, next.
Yes, thank you. Thank you very much, Roger. Yes, it was interesting. Just a couple of points of interest. In the very early 1980s, the Nottingham Trade Union Council, we were twinned, as often trade councils were with socialist countries. We were twinned with Minsk, then the capital of Belarus, which was part of the Soviet Union. They sent across delegations to us, and then we sent delegations across, which I was part of that delegation in the early 80s. Initially, they received us in Moscow, where we discussed the recent Afghanistan invasion, where we were able to say quite accurately how it would end and how we were against such invasions. When we went into Minsk, of course, we were joined by the party apparatchiks, which took us round to make sure that we met who they meant us to meet. And of course, we had cultural exchanges, and we visited art galleries, we visited theatres. But what was interesting was we went to an exhibition stroke art gallery, and having seen all the various 3 foot by 4 foot ginormous great paintings on the walls, we saw no contemporary modern art whatsoever. And although we asked the elderly party apparatchiks where this modern stuff was, he said quite pointedly, there has been no modern art here. That was quite telling. We then visited a school, which I then prepared to take quite a bit of Nottingham culture, literature. We had a big D.H. Lawrence folder, which the head teacher was absolutely over the moon because they had very, very little outside interests. They were very isolated in cultural history, etc., etc. And in fact, she said asked please take the address and send some stuff because they were very appreciative for that for the children. So I suppose really in conclusion, what I'm saying is, Roger, you're absolutely correct. I've got first-hand experience some 45 years ago of a very isolated politics and culture that we met there. Thank you.
Thank you, Chris. I mean, Roger or Chris, when would you pinpoint this turn? You know, when did it stop being a society that was embracing art and being in favor of experimentation, etc.? When did it start turning? Was it 21, 22? Later than that? Did art survive longer than political opposition?
That's a good question. Well, exactly. I think you'd say from the mid-20s that was already becoming very oppressive, and obviously when it came to the 30s, then you know the road was very clear to the Labour camps. It was, I mean, absolutely stifling. It was probably, you know, there was even under Tsarism, there was nothing like the same repression of literature. Although, you know, of course, as I said, writers did go to prison and get sent to Siberia. They did have to sometimes publish clandestinely. They had to sometimes publish abroad and so on. But nevertheless, I mean, all of the great Russian novels and so on, you look at them, they all have at least a strand of protest against the autocracy and criticism and satire of the autocracy, and that was permitted. There was, I mean, there's a famous example. Gogol wrote a play called The Government Inspector, which is again hilarious. So it's about a complete charlatan who turns up in a local village, and they think he's the government inspector, and so they're all terrified that he's going to expose all their corruption. So they bribe him and they offer him their wives and their daughters, and he just revels in all this. He can't imagine how he's struck gold, how he's struck so lucky. And then finally he leaves town, and then the real government inspector turns up, and they're all horrified. And the Tsar apparently watched this play, laughed himself sick over it, and he said, "Oh, he's got it in for everybody except me." And he completely misunderstood. Therefore, he thought, "Okay, he's attacking the lower bureaucrats and the lower ranks of the officialdom." But of course, actually, in a subtle and understated way, it precisely was an attack on Tsarism. It was an attack on the whole structure, the whole corruption of the state machine. So I don't know quite how I got to that, but I mean, then anyway, yeah, that's right. In other words, it was far more permissive, even under Tsarism, than under the once the Stalinist terror took hold.
Yeah, I think on that, I think you can, Roger's absolutely right. I think you can trace it through with literature as an aspect of art, right from the 1850s really to the 1950s and up to date, by looking at the repression, what type of literature came out, what came out when there was abroad from the Soviet Union. It actually, and all other aspects of the art was reflected in that literature, I feel.
Thank you. Richard, for a second bite of the cherry.
Hello. Yeah, just thought I'd add it to it that I mean, to be honest, we're talking about when it changed. I mean, I read recently, well, some time ago, some of the last pamphlets that Lenin wrote in his deathbed, and it's a real pity that in fact Lenin died at the time, because he was extremely critical of the bureaucracy, the way the education system was being developed, and he felt it was very stultifying. And I mean, obviously there was obviously a letter he sent he was supposedly sent, which wasn't actually released until 1950s, where he suggested that Stalin should be removed, but and Trotsky should be promoted. But it's just, I mean, the fact is, even in the 30s and 40s, a lot of the great literature, Osip Mandelstam, who was in prison and everything, and Motover. I mean, they all continued developing their literature, and although some of them obviously died in terrible circumstances, they still did struggle in those circumstances, and I think that's actually where it came. This came back during the de-Stalinization period in the late 50s, and then of course there was repression with Brezhnev and Kosygin, which was actually what promoted the Afghanistan adventure, which Gorbachev tried to, in the end, to stop. But I mean, I just saying, Lenin was particularly critical of the bureaucracy and the way that education was being ossified in Soviet culture. Thanks.
Thanks, Richard. Interesting.
Well, Lenin dragged himself out of his deathbed to write all these articles, which were printed. Some of them weren't, though.
Yep. Thanks. Do you want to say anything on that, Roger?
No, I think I'll pass.
Okay. John has volunteered to say something about Mikhail Bakhtin that Tamdin Berm asked about in the chat. Tam asked, Bakhtin seemed to have been able to work within the late Soviet system with some political integrity and much worth to say. And John, you actually know a bit about him.
Well, I don't know about that. I have an interest, and I've read him, and I find him fascinating. And I think it's one of the things for me. It partly explains my question earlier. Really, is that for Bakhtin, he's looking at language. He's looking at the nature of language, and he's looking at how powerful it can be. And not just in the obvious sense that you know you have your voice and you should be heard, but it's also the fact that language kind of competes to be heard. So in order for someone to take a kind of tyrannical control, or to impose a control on language, is something that Bakhtin would say that he speaks against that. So when it comes to thinking about literature, when it comes to thinking about the novel, then you have the language of the novel, but it's what's happening within the narrative, but also then within the characters. So there will be other languages within the language. That's breaking language down from beyond a national, breaking it down into sort of social dialect. I mean, anything that we look at today in linguistics kind of goes back to Bakhtin, I think. So when we look at the behaviors of individual groups, when we look at I don't know, the language of say the military will be a particular kind of language, and it's exclusive. It's creating a semantic field. The language of doctors and so on. And so within the Soviet era, I think Bakhtin is his antennae are up to being particularly sensitive to language, to jargon, to generic language, language across ages, but in particular then the language of authority, and how it's there's an imposition from above, and there are restrictions placed upon it. So my question earlier was really trying to get to the idea of, when we're thinking about the avant-garde in the way that the I'm sorry, I've forgotten the name of the gentleman who was speaking earlier, but when we think about, he was talking specifically about literature, then I think that there are always those two strands. We're looking at the political strand, but we're also looking at the artistic strand and the artistic development, whether it's actually, if you look at it in terms of painting, whether it's the way in which we're using form, expression, color, how these are they themselves are a language that may be more symbolic. whereas the language being used, the written word, the logocentric, that's something that's kind of concrete. You see it, but there will be elements of symbolism beyond it, of metaphor and conceptual ideas. And for me, anyway, Bakhtin is that's the space that he occupies, which is a very important space because it's incredibly political, as well as being moral and philosophical, scientific as well. And his point really in a novel is that you are combining all of these different layers together, and I think it's quite well, potentially liberating, but it's so radical, and it's something that I think he was a force, because I'm not sure that anyone was able to kind of fully understand what it was that he was trying to do. So he's your kind of ultimate revolutionary loose cannon, yeah. And so, for me, Bakhtin is one of the most important people. Perhaps there can be a future, I don't know what your agenda is, but perhaps there can be a future meeting where we actually kind of really focus on him, because there's so much to be said about avant-garde and Bakhtin, because I think he in many ways, when I think of the avant-garde in Russia, I'm thinking about Bakhtin.
Are you volunteering? Always need volunteers to do it.
Well, not anytime soon. If I had some time.
October is the next slot we have available, so you got lots of time.
For the October Revolution, okay, yeah.
Excellent. Tam's actually put in the chat that Bakhtin, as far as he knows, has done some work on carnival and sort of the understanding of culture of the masses and its physicality, located in the groin and lower regions, feet maybe. I don't know. So that sounds interesting. Yeah, okay. I've got your email address now from registration. I'll be in touch. Don't you worry. Thank you. Ian.
I just wanted to come back a little footnote, really, because of course Soviet art was hugely influential, not just in the Soviet Union, but its impact on the West was vast, and usually in a very positive way, especially in the early kind of revolutionary art. But fascinatingly, later on, the CIA actually sponsored abstract expressionism. So if you think of going into an art gallery and you're seeing a Jackson Pollock with all these just almost random splashes of paint all over the shop, and all the abstract expressionist school, the CIA would partly sponsor them. They didn't do it directly. They didn't just sort of send them a check or whatever. They would just do it by getting somebody to buy their art and making sure it got into a gallery. And and the aim was really to kind of counterpose the vibrant modern art of the West against the bizarre socialist realism, which of course was neither socialist nor realist. And it was a way in which the CIA, it was a rather sophisticated way that the CIA had of trying to show the Soviet Union up. And the interesting thing about it as well was, of course, very conservative figures within the USA were saying, well, what's this rubbish turning up in art galleries for? Bloody squirrels and squiggles and splashes and so ironically the abstract expressionists were given a platform which they wouldn't have otherwise had, but for the fact that the CIA wanted them to act as a kind of counter lever against socialist so-called realism. And it was opposed by conservatives in the United States. But the CIA do employ people who think about stuff and were very clever in the way in which they did. I'm not, incidentally, attacking abstract expressionism, although it doesn't really float my boat. But nevertheless, it's a fascinating little kind of footnote in the story of how avant-garde art has had a, shall we say, a dialectical relationship between Soviet and non-Soviet society.
Thanks, Ian. Well, in the Cold War, I guess anything goes, wasn't it? And you try to fight the war on every level, on any playing field that you could, including culture, including music, including all sorts. I mean, CIA.
There's a tiny footnote to Bakhtin, by the way. Part of the Bakhtin circle was Valentin Nikolaevich Voloshinov, who wrote a really quite interesting book on psychoanalysis, and it was a critique of psychoanalysis from a Marxist perspective, but that's incidental.
Thank you very much. Comrades, we've got no other hands up. I would suggest that I'm asking Roger. Oh, there's John. Would you like to talk? Sorry, we've got John Fitzgerald's got his hand up.
Yeah, hi. Thanks, Roger, for such really interesting stuff there, and everybody else. Yeah,
I've got to put
I do.
captions.
I am
I
aware.
can't quite hear properly. Sorry.
Oh,
Can I
sorry.
put captions on? Yeah.
I'm saying thanks for your wonderful introduction, and all the gaps that you managed to fill, because I imagine there are so many gaps that are still unfilled. I've always had an interest in Russian literature, not up to a point, not too much, but I've always been interested in that satirical way that they use literature to undermine the bureaucracy and so on. You said in the your introduction that Pussy Riot were arrested for a performance in a theatre. I thought they were actually arrested for a performance in an Orthodox church, a Russian Orthodox church, and that became an issue because of the church itself represents such a powerful, and of course Putin has been baptized now in the actual church. So the links there with the state and Pussy Riot, I thought that Orthodox Church aspect was kind of important. The other thing, of course, is nowadays we hear very little about censorship in Russia, and we don't. I mean, I don't anyhow hear a great deal. I haven't gone out of my way to catch up with the writers who are writing now. So, what kind of avant-garde as the new writers as such, and as to how their relationship with the state under Putin and so on, how this may be affecting their particular output. And I just use Pussy Riot as an example, perhaps, of that, being arrested for such a thing. Okay, that's it. Thanks.
Thanks, John. Roger, would you like to sum up this session, perhaps? What was sort of, when you're restudying all this subject, what was the important things for you, the 2-3 most important things?
Yeah, I won't speak for long because obviously there are gaps in my knowledge, and I've learned a lot from a lot of the contributions that comrades have made. And I've got it's given me an appetite to follow up some of these, particularly Bakhtin. And I do think if John or any other comrade is prepared to give a lead off on Bakhtin, I'd be very interested to hear it. What else is there really to say? I was interested about the reference to, I think Ian mentioned about Jackson Pollock. So I think there was maybe some comrades might think it's a bit of Philistinism on my part, but I mean I think that there's a kind of fake radicalism, if you like, that was sponsored by American imperialism, precisely to try to in a kind of cultural race with Russia because of the interest in even in the Russian artists and Russian writers that were in opposition and rebellion against the regime. I mean, the idea of arts where you just splash splash paint at random onto a canvas. That's, to me, that's not, there's nothing particularly artistic or creative about that. It's similarly you had in music, John Cage. I mean, this nonsense of, was it 4 minutes and how many seconds of silence is one of his compositions, and another where he would write music by holding up the sheet of music paper to the light, and the imperfections in the paper would become the notes. I mean, completely random things which sound very avant-garde and very iconoclastic and all the rest of it, but they are no kind of competition with the kind of creativity that I've been describing, which I think is just sort of a kaleidoscopic gold mine, if you like, of in literature, but also in art, in music, and all the rest of it, which came from Russia whenever it was able, even at great pains and at great risks and at great cost to the lives of their creators, but were able to produce something. That really, it's in those conditions perhaps that the greatest art and the greatest literature is created. One thing that I wanted to mention, because it occurred to me during this, is we didn't talk about films, or hardly. I mentioned the Gorky trilogy, which I strongly recommend to anybody. It's called My Childhood, My Apprenticeship, and My Universities. And the director is Mark Donskoy. By the way, Babel played a role in writing the screenplay for that film very shortly before his execution in the labor camps. And of course, his name was completely wiped out, the role that he played in that. But it's a great piece of work. And of course, it's the finest, in my opinion, the finest piece of writing that it's based on. It's very, very faithful to the text of Gorky's autobiographical trilogy. But I wanted to mention one film that I saw. I was there in the late 60s. I spent a year in Russia, and I was working in, if comrades remember, Progress Publishers. I was in a student year. I was able to act as an editor and in some cases translator for some crap that they were producing in for Progress Publishers. But anyway, I saw a film then which was called Ordinary Fascism, and it's a very, very good example of how, again, a writer, in this case a film producer, was able to smuggle in by subterfuge a kind of surreptitious criticisms of the regime, but while making it look completely orthodox and completely kosher. Because what this was it's made up of newsreels about fascism, and so it's a series of pictures of the Nazi stormtroopers and of Hitler at one ceremony or another, and I mean there were just a lot of with a very, very sarcastic commentary, which is really funny. It was really hilarious in the satirical comments made and the way that it exposes the nature of the fascist regimes, particularly Hitler regime. But every one of the comments made in relation to the Hitler regime could have been made about the Stalin regime and its successor regimes. And that was not lost on the audience, because I remember I was sitting in the cinema, and there was one of the sequences in the film was of Hitler opening an art gallery, and he goes to the art gallery and he sees all these beautiful pictures on the wall, every one of them portraits of Hitler. And there's a commentary just satirizing that, and somebody in the audience shouted out, just like here. So it was not lost. And again, it's a way of surreptitiously getting a critical message through, past the eye of the censors, in the same way that the Schwartz play about the dragon, for instance, that I mentioned before. So I just thought I'd mention that. Otherwise, look, I've learned a lot from what the comrades have said, and I've really enjoyed this discussion. So thanks, comrades.
Thank you very much, Roger. Thank you all for your very insightful contributions. We might disagree on what's good art and bad art. We might disagree on Pollock and John Cage, etc. But I think that's art's in the eye of the beholder often. It's certainly that the revolutionary period of Russia, the early 20th century, certainly opened up a lot of things across Europe as well, really not just in Russia. Comrades, if you have a film or a particular artist or a trend, anything you'd like to present to other socialists or the lefties, please get in touch. That's what our program is for. There isn't really the right line or the wrong line. I think we can discuss with each other, etc. So it'd be great. Email us info@ymarx.com and we can discuss an opening like that. So thank you very much, Roger. Thanks, comrades, for your comments and contributions, and see you next week for the ABC of Marxism. Bye-bye.
Thanks to all of you.